Just after midnight on July 30th, 1945, two torpedoes fired from a Japanese submarine struck the heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis in the Philippine Sea, and within 12 minutes, one of the fastest sinkings of a major American warship in the entire Pacific War was complete. Of the roughly 1,200 men aboard, close to 300 went down with the ship. The remaining 900 or so found themselves floating in open ocean, hundreds of miles from the nearest landfall, with almost no food, almost no fresh water, and no one on shore aware that anything had gone wrong at all. What followed over the next 4.5 days became one of the worst disasters in the history of the United States Navy. A slow, grinding ordeal of exposure, dehydration, and repeated shark attacks that killed far more men than the torpedoes themselves had. This is the story of what happened to the sailors who survived the sinking of the USS Indianapolis, and the decades-long fight over who was actually responsible for what happened to them afterward. The men aboard the Indianapolis that night ranged across the full spectrum of naval experience, from career officers who had served aboard the cruiser through years of earlier Pacific campaigns, to young sailors only recently assigned to the ship, many of them barely out of their teenage years and with only a few months of naval service behind them. This mixture of veteran and inexperienced crew would matter enormously in the days that followed, since survival in the water depended heavily on physical conditioning, swimming ability, and the kind of calm, disciplined thinking that came more naturally to men who had already weathered previous combat and crisis situations at sea. Advantages that older, more experienced sailors often carried into the disaster that the ship's youngest crew members did not yet possess. The Indianapolis had just completed one of the most secretive and consequential missions of the entire Second World War. In late July of 1945, the cruiser delivered components for the atomic bomb that would be dropped on Hiroshima days later to the American air base on Tinian Island, a mission carried out under such tight secrecy that even most of the ship's own crew had no idea what they were transporting. Having completed the delivery, the Indianapolis was ordered to proceed, unescorted, toward Leyte in the Philippines, sailing without a destroyer escort in a stretch of ocean that Naval Command believed carried relatively low risk of Japanese submarine activity at this late stage of the war, an assessment that would prove tragically mistaken. The Japanese submarine I-58, commanded by Mochitsura Hashimoto, encountered the Indianapolis in the early hours of July 30th, while on patrol in the same waters, firing a spread of torpedoes that struck the cruiser's bow and midsection. The damage was catastrophic and immediate. The forward part of the ship was torn away, and flooding spread through the hull so rapidly that Captain Charles McVey, the ship's commanding officer, had almost no time to organize an orderly evacuation before the Indianapolis rolled over and sank, taking a substantial portion of her crew down with her in the opening minutes of the attack alone. The secrecy surrounding the Tinian mission had its own strange consequences for what followed. Because so few people, even within the Navy's own communications and tracking systems, knew the Indianapolis's actual mission or precise routing in the days immediately before the sinking, the ship's movements were tracked with less rigor than a vessel on a more conventional assignment might have received. A security posture that made sense for protecting the secrecy of the atomic bomb components she had carried, but that left her, in the war's final chaotic weeks, more vulnerable to simply falling through the cracks of the Navy's tracking systems once she went missing. What followed the sinking became, in the words of naval historians who have studied the disaster in the decades since, a near-total breakdown of the systems meant to ensure that a sunken American warship would be noticed and its survivors rescued quickly. The Indianapolis had, in fact, transmitted distress signals before going down, and post-war investigation established that at least some of these signals were received by shore stations. But through a combination of bureaucratic confusion, skepticism about the message's authenticity, and simple failure to act on the reports that were received, No rescue effort was launched in the hours and days immediately following the sinking. Compounding the problem, the ship's expected arrival at Leyte came and went without anyone flagging its absence as significant, a failure attributed after the fact to a change in reporting procedures that meant overdue ships were not always immediately investigated as urgently as they should have been. Post-war investigation into the failure to notice the Indianapolis's absence identified 3 separate points in the naval communications and tracking chain where the warning signs of a missing ship should have been caught and were not. A compounding series of individually minor failures, a garbled or disbelieved distress signal here, a procedural change in overdue ship reporting there, that together produced a catastrophic 4.5-day gap between the sinking and the eventual rescue. No single officer or communications clerk was found to have made an obviously indefensible individual decision. It was, rather, a systemic failure distributed across multiple commands and personnel, which made it considerably harder, in the aftermath, to assign clear institutional responsibility compared to focusing blame on a single individual decision made aboard the ship itself. For the men in the water, this meant days of exposure with no knowledge that help was coming, or even that anyone on shore was aware they needed it. Survivors clustered together in groups, some with life rafts, many with only life jackets or improvised flotation, drifting apart from one another as currents and wind separated the larger initial group into smaller and smaller clusters over the following days. The physical toll of prolonged immersion compounded these dangers in ways that went beyond simple thirst. Extended exposure to seawater caused painful skin lesions and salt sores across the bodies of men who had no way to dry off or seek relief from constant contact with salt water. Injuries that grew progressively worse and more infected with each passing day. Direct tropical sun during daylight hours produced severe sunburn on exposed skin, while nighttime temperatures, considerably cooler than the daytime heat, brought a different form of physical suffering, as exhausted men, many already weakened by dehydration and blood loss from shark encounters, struggled with hypothermia-like symptoms during the darkest hours before dawn. Fresh water became a crisis within the first day, and men suffering from severe dehydration increasingly succumbed to the temptation to drink seawater, despite knowing the physiological consequences, a decision that reliably accelerated the onset of delirium, hallucination, and eventually death for those who gave in to it. Survivors who later gave detailed accounts of those days in the water frequently described a strange, disorienting rhythm to the ordeal. Long stretches of exhausted stillness and quiet, punctuated by sudden bursts of terror whenever a shark was spotted nearby, or when a nearby swimmer began showing the visible signs of severe delirium that often preceded a fatal decision to swim away from the group. Some survivors organized informal systems for tracking the passage of time and for periodically checking on the physical condition of others near them, small acts of mutual care and discipline that, according to several later accounts, helped preserve some measure of order and cooperation, even as physical conditions among the group deteriorated steadily with each passing day. Group cohesion, or the lack of it, played an enormous role in determining which survivors lived and which did not. Men who managed to stay clustered together in larger groups fared measurably better than those who drifted alone or in small, isolated clusters, both because larger groups could better organize the limited resources available, including the small number of life rafts carrying emergency supplies, and because sharks, according to survivor accounts collected afterward, appeared to target isolated individuals and the edges of smaller groups more readily than the center of larger, tightly clustered formations of survivors. This grim calculus meant that a man's chances of survival depended substantially on factors like where he happened to be positioned in the water when the ship went down, and which of the fracturing groups he ended up associated with, rather than purely on individual strength swimming ability, or willpower. The men in the water faced a second, more horrifying threat almost from the very first hours after the sinking. Sharks, drawn to the area by the noise and blood of the sinking itself, and the large number of men now floating helplessly on the surface. Oceanic white-tip sharks, a species known for aggressive behavior in open ocean conditions, exactly like those the Indianapolis survivors now found themselves in, began approaching and, within the first day, attacking isolated swimmers and the edges of larger groups, a threat that intensified as the days wore on and as exhausted, delirious men increasingly drifted away from the relative safety of clustered groups. Survivors described watching men disappear beneath the surface in sudden, violent attacks, an experience that added a specific and visceral terror to an ordeal that was already, in its physical demands alone, close to unbearable for men who had now spent days without adequate food, water, or rest. By the time Gwyn's aircraft happened upon the scene on August 2nd, survivors had already endured more than 3 full days and nights in the open ocean, a duration long enough that many of the men still alive at that point were suffering from severe delirium brought on by dehydration, saltwater ingestion, and exhaustion, with some survivors later describing hallucinations so vivid that they believed rescue ships or islands were nearby when none existed. Delusions that in several documented cases led disoriented men to swim away from the safety of their group toward imagined landfall, generally with fatal results. The eventual discovery of the survivors came almost entirely by accident. On August 2nd, more than 3 days after the sinking, a Navy PBY Ventura patrol aircraft, piloted by Lieutenant Wilbur Gwyn, flying a routine antenna repair mission rather than any kind of search operation, happened to spot what appeared to be an oil slick and men in the water far below. Gwyn radioed the sighting back to base, and within hours, additional aircraft were dispatched to the area, including a PBY Catalina flying boat, piloted by Lieutenant Adrian Marks, who made the extraordinary and, under standard procedure, explicitly prohibited decision to land his aircraft directly on the open ocean swells, to begin pulling survivors aboard immediately, rather than waiting for surface ships to arrive. A decision credited with saving a number of men who might not have survived the additional hours it took surface rescue vessels to reach the scene. Once Gwyn's sighting reached shore, the rescue response, though badly delayed relative to when it should ideally have begun, moved with real urgency once finally underway. Additional aircraft, surface ships, and eventually several destroyers were diverted to the area, and the rescue operation stretched across more than a day as searchers worked to locate the scattered clusters of survivors, some separated from one another by considerable distances after days of drifting on ocean currents. Marks's decision to land his Catalina directly on the open sea, against standing orders that prohibited such landings specifically because of the risk the aircraft itself could be damaged or lost in ocean swells, reflected a judgment call that prioritized the immediate, visible suffering of the men he could see in the water, over the standard procedural caution that would have had him simply mark the location and wait for surface vessels. A decision credited by multiple survivors and later naval historians, with directly saving a number of lives that would very likely have been lost in the additional hours a purely surface-based rescue would have required. Mochitsura Hashimoto, the Japanese submarine commander responsible for the attack, survived the war and, in the decades that followed, gave detailed accounts of the engagement from his own perspective, describing a straightforward submarine attack against what his crew correctly identified as an American warship in the final weeks of a war Japan was rapidly losing. Hashimoto's own post-war reflections on the attack focused primarily on the tactical circumstances of the engagement itself, rather than on what happened to the Indianapolis's crew afterward, a detail he had no way of knowing about at the time and limited ability to learn about in the years immediately following Japan's surrender. when contact between American Navy veterans and their former Japanese adversaries remained minimal. By the time rescue operations were fully underway, only 316 of the roughly 1,200 men who had been aboard the Indianapolis when she was struck were still alive, a casualty rate that made the sinking, when the delayed rescue and subsequent losses in the water are included alongside the initial sinking itself, one of the single deadliest losses of life from any American warship sunk during the entire Second World War. Survivors pulled from the water were, in many documented cases, suffering from severe sunburn, dehydration, exposure, and the physical and psychological after-effects of shark attacks witnessed at close range, conditions serious enough that a number of the rescued men required extended hospitalization before they were considered fit to return home. The scale of the news blackout surrounding the disaster added its own layer of strangeness to how the sinking was understood by the American public in the immediate aftermath. Japan formally surrendered within days of the survivors being rescued, and the Navy did not publicly announce the loss of the Indianapolis until after the surrender had already been announced, a timing that meant a disaster resulting in the deaths of hundreds of American sailors was, for a brief but genuinely strange window, overshadowed in public awareness by the far larger news of the war's end, a juxtaposition that some historians have suggested may have reduced the immediate public scrutiny the Navy might otherwise have faced over the failures that led to the delayed rescue. The disaster's aftermath produced a controversy that would occupy American naval and legal circles for decades afterward. Captain Charles McVey, the Indianapolis's commanding officer, was court-martialed later in 1945 on charges related to his failure to order the ship into a zigzagging evasive pattern in the hours before the attack, a maneuver intended to make submarine targeting more difficult. McVey was convicted, becoming the only United States Navy captain court-martialed for the loss of a ship to enemy action during the entire Second World War, a distinction that struck many naval officers and, eventually, historians as deeply unjust given the actual circumstances of the sinking. The specific charges brought against McVey reflected a deliberate choice by naval authorities about which aspects of the disaster to place under legal scrutiny at all. The court-martial focused narrowly on the zigzagging question rather than on the systemic communications and tracking failures that had turned a survivable sinking into a 4.5-day ordeal, a framing that concentrated legal and public attention on a single command decision made by the ship's captain, rather than on the broader institutional failures spread across multiple commands and communications stations that had left hundreds of men stranded in shark-infested water for days without anyone actively searching for them. The case against McVey was seriously undermined by testimony from an unexpected source. Mochitsura Hashimoto himself, the Japanese submarine commander who had fired the torpedoes, was brought to testify at the court-martial and stated plainly that zigzagging would have made no meaningful difference to his ability to target and sink the Indianapolis, given the conditions and positioning of his submarine at the time of the attack. Despite this testimony from the one person with direct, first-hand knowledge of whether the maneuver McVey was accused of failing to order would have actually mattered, the court-martial proceeded to conviction, a verdict that many surviving crew members and, in later decades, professional naval historians came to view as a scapegoating exercise driven more by the Navy's need to assign blame for a disaster involving significant institutional failures of its own than by any fair assessment of McVey's actual culpability. Surviving crew members themselves, in the decades following the disaster, increasingly organized to advocate for McVey's exoneration, holding regular reunions at which the question of their former captain's unjust treatment remained a recurring and deeply felt topic of conversation, a rare case of a military unit's surviving veterans actively campaigning on behalf of the officer who had commanded them. Driven by a shared conviction among many survivors that McVey had been made to bear institutional blame that properly belonged to failures far outside his control, as the ship's commanding officer during the attack itself. Charles McVey lived the remainder of his life under the weight of the court-martial conviction, receiving hate mail from grieving family members of Indianapolis crew members who held him personally responsible for their loved ones' deaths, despite the significant institutional failures, including the mishandled distress signals and the overdue ship reporting failures, that had contributed substantially to the scale of the disaster and that lay far outside McVey's own individual decisions as the ship's captain. McVey took his own life in 1968, a death that surviving crew members and naval historians alike have since connected directly to the decades of blame he carried, following a conviction increasingly understood, even at the time, by many of his fellow officers, as unjust. Hunter Scott's involvement in the case began almost by accident, sparked by watching a popular film that referenced the Indianapolis disaster and prompting a middle school history assignment that grew, through his own initiative, into a multi-year research project involving direct correspondence and interviews with dozens of surviving crew members, several of whom traveled to testify before Congress alongside Scott himself, as the campaign for exoneration gathered momentum through the final years of the 1990s. The image of elderly Navy veterans, many by then in their 70s, sitting alongside a teenage boy to advocate jointly for a resolution more than 5 decades in the making, became one of the more widely covered human interest stories connected to the broader push for McVey's exoneration, helping draw national media attention to a case that might otherwise have remained a matter of specialist naval history interest rather than mainstream news coverage. The push to formally clear McVey's name gained unexpected momentum decades later through the efforts of a schoolboy named Hunter Scott, who, in the late 1990s, undertook a school history project examining the Indianapolis disaster and became convinced, through his own research and interviews with surviving crew members, that McVey had been unfairly convicted. Scott's project drew national attention and eventually reached members of the United States Congress, and in the year 2000, Congress passed a resolution formally exonerating McVey, with President Bill Clinton signing legislation acknowledging that McVey's court-martial conviction had been unjust, a resolution of the case that arrived more than 3 decades after McVey's own death, and more than half a century after the disaster itself. Hashimoto himself, still alive at the time of the exoneration campaign in the late 1990s, offered his own support for clearing McVey's name, a gesture that added a striking and somewhat unusual note of reconciliation to the case. The very submarine commander, who had fired the torpedoes decades earlier, publicly endorsing the effort to formally clear the reputation of the man who had commanded the ship he sank. Both men by then elderly veterans of a war that had ended more than half a century before. Hashimoto died in the year 2000, shortly after Congress passed the resolution exonerating McVey, a rough coincidence of timing that several commentators covering the case noted at the time as a strange closing note to a story that had connected 2 former wartime adversaries across more than 5 decades. The USS Indianapolis's wreck itself remained undiscovered for more than 7 decades after the sinking, its precise location unknown despite periodic search efforts, until a research expedition funded in part by a private technology entrepreneur located the wreckage on the floor of the Philippine Sea in 2017, finally providing physical confirmation of exactly where and how the disaster's final chapter had unfolded, more than 70 years after the men who survived it had already lived out the remainder of their own lives, carrying the memory of what had happened to them, and to the shipmates who did not survive alongside them. The 2017 discovery of the wreck itself, resting more than 3 miles below the surface of the Philippine Sea, was conducted using deep-water search technology far beyond anything available during earlier search attempts in previous decades. And the expedition's team worked in direct consultation with naval historians and, where possible, surviving crew members and their families, to help narrow the search area based on known currents, the timing of the sinking, and the ship's last confirmed position before contact was lost. The discovery generated renewed public and media interest in the disaster, prompting a fresh wave of documentary coverage and historical re-examination of the case, more than 7 decades after the sinking itself, introducing the story to audiences who had grown up with little to no awareness of the disaster or the decades-long fight over Captain McVey's reputation that had followed it. By the time of the wreck's discovery, only a small handful of the original survivors remained alive to see confirmation of exactly where their ship had come to rest. Most of the roughly 316 men rescued from the water in 1945, having died of age and illness in the intervening decades. A detail that underscored just how long the fight over the disaster's full history, the sinking itself, the delayed rescue, McVey's unjust conviction, and the eventual exoneration, had actually taken to fully resolve, spanning nearly the entire remaining lifetimes of the men who had lived through it. If you want to understand how a ship that had just completed one of the most secret and consequential missions of the entire war became the site of the worst shark-related maritime disaster in recorded history, and how the man blamed for it spent the rest of his life paying for institutional failures that were never fully his own, this is the story worth knowing in full. Subscribe to Pacific War Tales for more long-form World War II history from the Pacific Theater, told with the names, the dates, and the details intact.